I'm John Batchelor. My colleague and co-host, Thaddeus McCotter, WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes, joins me. Good evening to you, Thaddeus.
Good evening, John.
There's a lot of excitement in East Asia these last hours after the President-elect of the United States pointed to something called the One China policy, and we need a definition. And now we learn that China, the PRC, decided in response in some fashion to the President-elect's remarks, which need explanation, it was going to fly warplanes around Taiwan, an independent capitalist democracy. Just so happens that the president of Taiwan had a conversation with the president-elect some days past. Gordon Chang, our colleague of the Daily Beast, joins because a week ago when we discussed this, good evening to you, Gordon.
Good evening, John and
A week ago, you mentioned in passing that there was this odd behavior by China before the president-elect's phone call with President of Taiwan, where nuclear-capable bombers flew near or by in some fashion over, around the South China Sea, the East China Sea, some fashion. But we couldn't actually connect those dots because it was before the phone call, so perhaps it was random. Now it's happened again, Gordon. I think this entirely vindicates your prescience that the Chinese are looking to respond in some militant fashion. What happened on Saturday, Asia time, Friday, U.S. time, Gordon?
John, China flew four planes clockwise around Taiwan. This is the second time this has occurred because, as you mentioned, on November 25th, China flew four planes, including two nuclear-capable bombers, around Taiwan counterclockwise. This is the first time they ever pulled that stunt. I believe that they did this on November 25 because they knew that Trump and Tsai were going to talk, and it was a warning to both of them not to do so. Clearly, the fly around on this Saturday is an indication that they wanted to punish Tsai and Trump for that phone call, saying that if they continued, there would be military provocations. So what we have right now are two fly-arounds, and I think they're connected to the call.
We welcome Russell Hsiao, Executive Director of Global Taiwan Institute. The website is globaltaiwan.org. Russell, a very good evening to you. This provocation, this threat, how does this look to Taipei tonight? Can you help us understand how the people of Taiwan are regarding this? Good evening to you.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on the show. And to your question about, the signals from these two military exercises that Gordon, I think, explained accurately, is that even though I'm not clear as to whether the objectives behind the November 25th exercise, I think it clears, there shouldn't be any doubt that the December 10th exercise that in Asia time was clearly meant as a warning to Taiwan and about any sort of provocations that it sees as moving away from its One China principle. And I think that there is a precedent for Beijing to utilize military tactics for political coercion, in the sense that we saw that in 1995 and 1996 during the third Taiwan Strait crisis, wherein Beijing, the PLA, engaged in missile tests in the Taiwan Strait in order to intimidate the voters of Taiwan from participating in its first direct presidential election, and it just created the opposite effect that I think it had intended. And so it makes me wonder what really is Beijing's objective at this point right now, if it should have learned its lessons in 1995 and 1996, in which case U.S. responded with an overwhelming show of force in sailing two carrier battle groups towards the Taiwan Strait. So I think this is a very interesting time, and I think we really need to parse out what the implications of this are.
Thaddeus, you have a question for our guest.
Yes, Russell. What kind of response would the people of Taiwan, like to see from the United States, if any, in regard to this provocation by the Communist Chinese?
Well, I think that's a great question. First of all, I'd like to address the sort of measured response that I've seen from Taiwan. And I think, for all that Beijing has tried to paint the new president of Taiwan as some type of independence fanatic, is that we've seen the opposite sort of signal from Taipei in terms of its measured response to this phone call, in which the president had gone and announced and speaking to the press that the phone call does not indicate any policy change on the part of the United States. And I think that reflects really a well-measured approach to trying to maintain stability in the Taiwan Strait. And I think really with regards to really seeing the response, I think that the indications right now that that the new incoming administration will treat the Taiwan with dignity and respect is a positive trajectory. And I think signals that have been put forward in terms of perhaps a more supportive of Taiwan's defense would be a positive indicator for greater stability and reassurances in the Asia-Pacific.
Gordon, you have a question for our guest.
So the Taiwan Ministry of Defense immediately announced the fly-around on Saturday, December 10th. This, I think, was in reaction to the ministry waiting about a week and a half to announce the November 25 fly-around. And as, of course, the government got criticism for the delayed announcement. At the time of the delayed announcement of the November 25 fly-around, the Taiwan ministry said this had no connection. The fly-around had no connection to the Tsai phone call with Donald Trump. Do people in Taiwan believe that? And what is your analysis?
Well, I think the phone call before I think the response was an attempt on the part of the Ministry of Defense, National Defense, to I think not intimidate, well, not to sort of succumb to the sort of the intimidation tactics of the PRC. And in terms of whether or not this was actually an intention, well, I would add that although there are routine exercises undertaken by the BLA, I think the last such exercise before the November 25th one was back in September, that they do occur. But I do think that in the quick succession in between the November 25th exercise and the December 10th exercise highlights, I think, the clear signal that the December 10th exercise indicates as a signal to Taiwan.
Russell, help me understand here. Is this about Taiwan, or is this about the new president in Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, who is in the opposition to the Kuomintang and took positions sharply critical of President Ma, who was seen as very friendly to PRC? So are these provocations meant to be a partisan rebuke of one party and not all of Taiwan? And is that acceptable to the people of Taiwan, that China's looking to interfere in some fashion?
That's an excellent question, John, and I think you highlighted an important trend that I've seen at least immediately following the election results. As you mentioned, the new president of Taiwan, who won in a landslide victory back in January, has been what is traditionally viewed from the party that has been more against closer relationship with the PRC. But there has been signals that, well, even before her inauguration, that Beijing had already been sort of squeezing Taiwan prematurely in terms of trying to extract concessions from her, political concessions from her in her inauguration speech. And so I think that the actions on the part of the PRC in terms of its reaction, initial reaction to the phone call, which had been to try to lay the blame at the feet of Tsai, calling it a sort of a little trick and or some kind of a small trick with shenanigans that has been translated by different media outlets, was an attempt to try to then again try to lay the blame of the cooling of cross-strait relations on her. On her. And yet, though, I think the measured response that Tsai Ing-wen has given to indicate that this phone call does not indicate any radical change in U.S. policy reflects the growing consensus within Taiwan, which really wants to maintain the status quo. I think the last polling statistics I saw from the Mainland Affairs Council indicated that overwhelmingly 90% of the people surveyed, and by that poll, had indicated they want to maintain the status quo.
Right.
And so I think that's a very important point to raise.
Thaddeus, you have time for another question.
In terms of the response from the PRC, were there other non-martial means available for them to convey their point, or is this just what they do?
Well, there's certainly other means for them to convey their points, but military, as I mentioned earlier, using military taxes as means to sort of send political signals is not unprecedented and actually quite a common feature of Chinese policy towards Taiwan. There are other means and levers in which they are trying to attempt to use. There are diplomatic, of course, in terms of trying to utilize squeezing Taiwan's international space. We saw that in a lot of the deportations of citizens of Taiwan from third-party countries that adhere to the One China principle, the so-called One China principle, in which they would deport citizens of Taiwan to extradite them to China, to the People's Republic of China. Now, there are also economic leverages that they try to attempt to use often to try to squeeze not only Taiwanese businessmen that work in China, but also to try to curb this sort of the tourism trade, the tourism that to Taiwan, to try to sort of weaken, sort of strengthen domestic pressure on Taiwan and on administration. So there's certainly multiple levers, but I think the military tactics, the military lever, is one that Beijing decided to use at this particular point.
Russell Hsiao is Executive Director of Global Taiwan Institute. That's globaltaiwan.org. Gordon Chang of the Daily Beast. Thaddeus McCotter, my colleague. WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes. China responds with nuclear-capable bombers. I'm John Batchelor.